双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Glasses by Henry James. Chapter 1. Yes, indeed. I say to myself, pen in hand, I can keep hold of the thread and let it lead me back to the first impression. The little story is all there. I can touch it from point to point, for the thread, as I call it, is a row of colored beads on a string. None of the beads are missing, at least I think they're not. That's exactly what I shall amuse myself with finding out. I had been all summer working hard in town, and then had gone down to Folkestone for a blow. Art was long, I felt, and my holiday short. My mother was settled at Folkestone, and I paid her a visit when I could. I remember how on this occasion, after weeks in my stuffy studio with my nose on my palette, I sniffed up the clean salt air and cooled my eyes with a purple sea. The place was full of lodgings, and the lodgings were at that season full of people who had nothing to do but to stare at one another on the great flat down. There were thousands of little chairs and almost as many little Jews, and there was music in an open rotunda, over which the little Jews wagged their big noses. We all strolled to and fro, and took pennyworths of rest. The long, level cliff top, edged in places with its iron rail, might have been the deck of a huge crowded ship. There were old folks in bath chairs, and there was one dear chair, creeping to its last full stop, by the side of which I always walked. There was in fine weather the coast of France to look at, and there were the usual things to say about it. There was also in every state of the atmosphere our friend, Mrs. Meldrum, a subject of remark not less inveterate, the widow of an officer in the engineers. She had settled, like many members of the martial miscellany, well within sight of the hereditary enemy, who however had left her leisure to form in spite of the difference of their years a close alliance with my mother. She was the hardiest, the keenest, the ugliest of women, the least apologetic, the least morbid in her misfortune. She carried it high aloft with loud sounds and free gestures, made it flutter in the breeze as if it had been the flag of her country. It consisted mainly of a big red face, indescribably out of drawing, from which she glared at you through gold-rimmed aids to vision, optic circles of such diameter and so frequently displaced that someone had vividly spoken of her as flattering her nose against the glass of her spectacles. She was extraordinarily nearsighted, and whatever they did to other objects they magnified immensely the kind eyes behind them. Blessed conveniences they were. In their hideous, honest strength they showed the good lady everything in the world but her own queerness. This element was enhanced by wild braveries of dress, reckless charges of color and stubborn resistances of cut, wondrous encounters in which the art of the toilet seemed to lay down its life. She had the tread of a grenadier and the voice of an angel. In the course of a walk with her the day after my arrival, I found myself grabbing her arm with sudden and undue familiarity. I had been struck by the beauty of a face that approached us, and I was still more affected when I saw the face, at the sight of my companion, open like a window thrown wide. A smile fluttered out of it and brightly as a drapery dropped from a sill, a drapery shaken there in the sun by a young lady flanked by two young men. A wonderful young lady who, as we drew nearer, rushed up to Mrs. Meldrum with arms flourished for an embrace. My immediate impression of her had been that she was dressed in mourning, but during the few moments she stood talking with our friend, I made more discoveries. The figure from the neck down was meager, the stature insignificant, but the desire to please towered high, as well as the air of infallibly knowing how and of never missing it. This was a little person whom I would have made a high bid for a good chance to paint. The head, the features, the color, the whole facial oval and radiance had a wonderful purity. The deep gray eyes the most agreeable, I thought, that I had ever seen, brushed with a kind of wing-like grace every object they encountered. Their possessor was just back from Boulogne, where she had spent a week with dear Mrs. Floyd Taylor. This accounted for the effusiveness of her reunion with dear Mrs. Meldrum. Her black garments were of the freshest and daintiest. She suggested a pink and white wreath at a showy funeral. She confounded us for 3 minutes with her presence. She was a beauty of the great conscious public responsible order. The young men, her companions, gazed at her and grinned. I could see there were very few moments of the day at which young men, these or others, would not be so occupied. The people who approached took leave of their manners. Everyone seemed to linger and gape. When she brought her face close to Mrs. Meldrum's end, she appeared to be always bringing it close to somebody's. It was a marvel that objects so dissimilar should express the same general identity. The unmistakable character of the English gentlewoman. Mrs. Meldrum sustained the comparison with her usual courage, but I wondered why she didn't introduce me. I should have had no objection to the bringing of such a face close to mine. However, by the time the young lady moved on with her escort, she herself bequeathed me a sense that some such rapprochement might still occur. Was this by reason of the general frequency of encounters at Folkestone, or by reason of a subtle acknowledgment that she contrived to make of the rights, on the part of others, that such beauty as hers created? I was in a position to answer that question after Mrs. Meldrum had answered a few of mine. Chapter 2. Flora Sant, the only daughter of an old soldier, had lost both her parents. Her mother within a few months. Mrs. Meldrum had known them, disapproved of them, considerably avoided them. She had watched the girl, off and on, from her early childhood. Flora, just 20, was extraordinarily alone in the world, so alone that she had no natural chaperone, no one to stay with but a mercenary stranger, Mrs. Hammond Singh, the sister-in-law of one of the young men I had just seen. She had lots of friends, but none of them nice. She kept picking up impossible people. The Floyd Taylors, with whom she had been at Boulogne, were simply horrid. The Hammond Singhs were perhaps not so vulgar, but they had no conscience in their dealings with her. She knows what I think of them, said Mrs. Meldrum. And indeed, she knows what I think of most things. She shares that privilege with most of your friends, I replied, laughing. No doubt, but possibly to some of my friends it makes a little difference. That girl doesn't care a button. She knows best of all what I think of Flora Sant. And what may her opinion be? Why, that she's not worth troubling about. An idiot too abysmal. Doesn't she care for that? Just enough, as you saw, to hug me till I cry out. She's too pleased with herself for anything else to matter. Surely, my dear friend, I rejoined. She has a good deal to be pleased with. So everyone tells her, and so you would have told her if I had given you the chance. However, that doesn't signify either, for her vanity is beyond all making or mending. She believes in herself, and she's welcome, after all. Poor dear, having only herself to look to. I've seldom met a young woman more completely free to be silly. She has a clear course, she'll make a showy finish. Well, I replied, as she probably will reduce many persons to the same degraded state, her partaking of it won't stand out so much. If you mean that the world's full of twaddlers, I quite agree with you, cried Mrs. Meldrum, trumpeting her laugh half across the channel. I had after this to consider a little what she would call my mother's son, but I didn't let it prevent me from insisting on her making me acquainted with Flora Sant. Indeed, I took the bull by the horns, urging that she had drawn the portrait of a nature which common charity now demanded of her to put into relation with a character really fine. Such a frail creature was just an object of pity. This contention, on my part, had at first of course been jocular, but strange to say, it was quite the ground I found myself taking with regard to our young lady after I had begun to know her. I couldn't have said what I felt about her except that she was undefended, from the first of my sitting with her there after dinner. Under the stars that was a week at Folkestone of balmy nights and muffled tides and crowded chairs, I became aware both that protection was wholly absent from her life and that she was wholly indifferent to its absence. The odd thing was that she was not appealing. She was abjectly, divinely conceited, absurdly, fantastically pleased. Her beauty was as yet all the world to her, a world she had plenty to do to live in. Mrs. Meldrum told me more about her. and there was nothing that, as the center of a group of giggling, nudging spectators, Flora wasn't ready to tell about herself. She held her little court in the crowd, upon the grass, playing her light over Jews and Gentiles, completely at ease in all promiscuities. It was an effect of these things that from the very first, with everyone listening, I could mention that my main business with her would be just to have a go at her head and to arrange in that view for an early sitting. It would have been as impossible, I think, to be impertinent to her as it would have been to throw a stone at a plate glass window. So any talk that went forward on the basis of her loveliness was the most natural thing in the world, and immediately became the most general and sociable. It was when I saw all this that I judged how, though it was the last thing she asked for, what one would ever most have at her service was a curious compassion. That sentiment was colored by the vision of the dire exposure of a being whom vanity had put so off her guard. Hers was the only vanity I have ever known that made its possessor superlatively soft. Mrs. Meldrum's further information contributed moreover to these indulgences her account of the girl's neglected childhood and queer continental relegations, with straying, squabbling, Monte Carlo haunting parents, the more invidious picture, above all, of her pecuniary arrangement, still in force, with the Hammond Sings, who really, though they never took her out practically, she went out alone, had their hands half the time in her pocket. She had to pay for everything, down to her share of the wine bills and the horses' fodder, down to Bertie Hammond Sing's fare in the underground when he went to the city for her. She had been left with just money enough to turn her head, and it hadn't even been put in trust. Nothing prudent or proper had been done with it. She could spend her capital, and at the rate she was going, expensive, extravagant, and with a swarm of parasites to help, it certainly wouldn't last very long. Couldn't you perhaps take her, independent, unencumbered as you are? Asked of Mrs. Meldrum. You're probably, with one exception, the sanest person she knows, and you at least wouldn't scandalously fleece her. How do you know what I wouldn't do? My humorous friend demanded. Of course I've thought how I can help her. It has kept me awake at night. But doing it's impossible. She'll take nothing from me. You know what she does? She hugs me and runs away. She has an instinct about me and feels that I've won about her. And then she dislikes me for another reason that I'm not quite clear about, but that I'm well aware of and that I shall find out some day. So far as her settling with me goes, it would be impossible moreover here. She wants naturally enough a much wider field. She must live in London. Her game is there. So she takes the line of adoring me, of saying she can never forget that I was devoted to her mother, which I wouldn't for the world have been, and of giving me a wide berth. I think she positively dislikes to look at me. It's all right. There's no obligation, though people in general can't take their eyes off me. I see that at this moment, I replied. But what does it matter where or how? For the present, she lives, she'll marry infallibly, marry early, and everything then will change. Whom will she marry? My companion gloomily asked. Anyone she likes. She's so abnormally pretty that she can do anything. She'll fascinate some nabob or some prince. She'll fascinate him first and bore him afterwards. Moreover, she's not so pretty as you make her out. She hasn't a scrap of a figure. No doubt. But one doesn't in the least miss it. Not now, said Mrs. Meldrum. But one will when she's older, and when everything will have to count. When she's older she'll count as a princess. So it won't matter. She has other drawbacks. My companion went on. Those wonderful eyes are good for nothing but to roll about like sugar balls, which they greatly resemble in a child's mouth. She can't use them. Use them? Why? She does nothing else. To make fools of young men, but not to read or write, not to do any sort of work. She never opens a book, and her maid writes her notes. You'll say that those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Of course I know that if I didn't wear my goggles, I shouldn't be good for much. Do you mean that Miss Son ought to sport such things? I exclaimed with more horror than I meant to show. I don't prescribe for her. I don't know that they're what she requires. What's the matter with her eyes? I asked after a moment. I don't exactly know. But I heard from her mother years ago that even as a child they had for a while to put her into spectacles, and that though she hated them and had been in a fury of disgust, she would always have to be extremely careful.
I'm sure I hope she is.
I echoed the hope, but I remember well the impression this made upon me, my immediate pang of resentment, a disgust almost equal to Flora's own. I felt as if a great rare sapphire had split in my hand. Chapter 3. This conversation occurred the night before I went back to town. I settled on the morrow to take a late train, so that I had still my morning to spend at Folkestone, where during the greater part of it I was out with my mother. Everyone in the place was as usual out with someone else. And even had I been free to go and take leave of her, I should have been sure that Flora Sant would not be at home. Just where she was I presently discovered. She was at the far end of the cliff, the point at which it overhangs the pretty view of Sandgate and Hythe. Her back, however, was turned to this attraction. It rested with the aid of her elbows thrust slightly behind her, so that her scanty little shoulders were raised toward her ears. On the high rail that enclosed the down, 2 gentlemen stood before her whose faces we couldn't see, but who, even as observed from the rear, were visibly absorbed in the charming figure-piece submitted to them. I was freshly struck with the fact that this meager and defective little person, with the cock of her hat and the flutter of her crape, with her eternal idleness, her eternal happiness, her absence of moods and mysteries, and the pretty presentation of her feet, which especially now in the supported slope of her posture occupied with their imperceptibility so much of the foreground, I was reminded anew. I say, how our young lady dazzled by some art that the enumeration of her merits didn't explain, and that the mention of her lapses didn't affect. Where she was amiss, nothing counted, and where she was right, everything did. I say she was wanting in mystery, but that after all was her secret. This happened to be my first chance of introducing her to my mother, who had not much left in life but the quiet look from under the hood of her chair at the things which, when she should have quitted those she loved, she could still trust to make the world good for them. I wondered an instant how much she might be moved to trust Flora Sant, and then while the chair stood still and she waited, I went over and asked the girl to come and speak to her. In this way I saw that if one of Flora's attendants was the inevitable young Hammond Singh, master of ceremonies of her regular court, always offering the use of a telescope and accepting that of a cigar, the other was a personage I had not yet encountered, a small pale youth in showy knickerbockers, whose eyebrows and nose and the glued points of whose little mustache were extraordinarily uplifted and sustained. I remember taking him at first for a foreigner and for something of a pretender. I scarce know why, unless because of the motive I felt in the stare he fixed on me when I asked Miss Sant to come away. He struck me a little as a young man practicing the social art of impertinence, but it didn't matter, for Flora came away with alacrity, bringing all her prettiness and pleasure, and gliding over the grass in that rustle of delicate morning which made the endless variety of her garments, as a painter could take heed, strike one always as the same obscure elegance. She seated herself on the floor of my mother's chair, a little too much on her right instep as I afterwards gathered, caressing her still hand, smiling up into her cold face, commending and approving her without a reserve and without a doubt. She told her immediately, as if it were something for her to hold on by, that she was soon to sit to me for a likeness. And these words gave me a chance to inquire if it would be the fate of the picture, should I finish it, to be presented to the young man in the knickerbockers. Her lips, at this, parted in a stare. Her eyes darkened to the purple of one of the shadow patches on the sea. She showed for the passing instant the face of some splendid, tragic mask, and I remembered for the inconsequence of it what Mrs. Meldrum had said about her sight. I had derived from this lady a worrying impulse to catechize her, but that didn't seem exactly kind, so I substituted another question, inquiring who the pretty young man in knickerbockers might happen to be. Oh, a gentleman I met at Boulogne. He has come over to see me. After a moment she added, Lord Iffield. I had never heard of Lord Iffield, but her mention of his having been at Boulogne helped me to give him a niche. Mrs. Meldrum had incidentally thrown a certain light on the manners of Mrs. Floyd Taylor, Flora's recent hostess in that charming town, a lady who, it appeared, had a special vocation for helping rich young men to find a use for their leisure. She had always one or other in hand, and had apparently on this occasion pointed her lesson at the rare creature on the opposite coast. I had a vague idea that Boulogne was not a resort of the world's envied. At the same time, there might very well have been a strong attraction there even for one of the darlings of fortune. I could perfectly understand in any case that such a darling should be drawn to Folkestone by Florissant. But it was not in truth of these things I was thinking. What was uppermost in my mind was a matter which, though it had no sort of keeping, insisted just then on coming out. "Is it true, Miss Sant," I suddenly demanded, "that you're so unfortunate as to have had some warning about your beautiful eyes?" I was startled by the effect of my words. The girl threw back her head, changing color from brow to chin. "True? Who in the world says so?" I repented of my question in a flash. The way she met it made it seem cruel, and I felt my mother look at me in some surprise. I took care, in answer to Flora's challenge, not to incriminate Mrs. Meldrum. I answered that the rumor had reached me only in the vaguest form, and that if I had been moved to put it to the test, my very real interest in her must be held responsible. Her blush died away, but a pair of still prettier tears glistened in its track. "If you ever hear such a thing said again, you can say it's a horrid lie." I had brought on a commotion deeper than any I was prepared for, but it was explained in some degree by the next words she uttered. "I'm happy to say there's nothing the matter with any part of me whatever. Not the least little thing." She spoke with her habitual complacency, with triumphant assurance. She smiled again, and I could see how she wished that she hadn't so taken me up. She turned it off with a laugh. "I've good eyes, good teeth, a good digestion, and a good temper. I'm sound of wind and limb." Nothing could have been more characteristic than her blush and her tears. Nothing less acceptable to her than to be thought not perfect in every particular. She couldn't submit to the imputation of a flaw. I expressed my delight in what she told me, assuring her I should always do battle for her. And as if to rejoin her companions, she got up from her place on my mother's toes. The young men presented their backs to us. They were leaning on the rail of the cliff. Our incident had produced a certain awkwardness, and while I was thinking of what next to say, she exclaimed irrelevantly, "Don't you know? He'll be Lord Considine." At that moment the youth marked for this high destiny turned round, and she spoke to my mother. "I'll introduce him to you, he's awfully nice." She beckoned and invited him with her parasol. The movement struck me as taking everything for granted. I had heard of Lord Considine, and if I had not been able to place Lord Iffield, it was because I didn't know the name of his eldest son. The young man took no notice of Miss Sant's appeal. He only stared a moment, and then on her repeating it quietly turned his back. She was an odd creature. She didn't blush at this. She only said to my mother apologetically, but with the frankest, sweetest amusement, "You don't mind, do you? He's a monster of shyness." It was as if she were sorry for everyone, for Lord Iffield, the victim of a complaint so painful, and for my mother, the subject of a certain slight. "I'm sure I don't want him," said my mother. But Flora added some promise of how she would handle him for his rudeness. She would clearly never explain anything by any failure of her own appeal. There rolled over me while she took leave of us, and floated back to her friends, a wave of superstitious dread. I seemed somehow to see her go forth to her fate, and yet what should fill out this orb of a high destiny if not such beauty and such joy? I had a dim idea that Lord Considine was a great proprietor, and though there mingled with it a faint impression that I shouldn't like his son, the result of the two images was a whimsical prayer that the girl mightn't miss her possible fortune. Chapter 4. One day in the course of the following June there was ushered into my studio a gentleman whom I had not yet seen, but with whom I had been very briefly in correspondence. A letter from him had expressed to me some days before his regret on learning that my splendid portrait of Miss Flora Louisa Sant, whose full name figured by her own wish in the catalogue of the exhibition of the Academy, had found a purchaser before the close of the private view. He took the liberty of inquiring whether I might have at his service some other memorial of the same lovely head, some preliminary sketch, some study for the picture. I had replied that I had indeed painted Miss Sant more than once, and that if he were interested in my work, I should be happy to show him what I had done. Mr. Geoffrey Dolling, the person thus introduced to me, stumbled into my room with awkward movements and equivocal sounds, a long, lean, confusing young man, with a bad complexion and large protrusive teeth. He bore in its most indelible pressure the postmark, as it were, of Oxford, and as soon as he opened his mouth I perceived, in addition to a remarkable revelation of gums, that the text of the queer communication matched the registered envelope. He was full of refinements and angles,